Why would anyone make a wish to a fire? The question stopped Daniel Mercer halfway through wiping flour from the galley counter. Across Port Meridian's crowded dining hall, Sailor Aven stood perfectly still beside a birthday cake she clearly did not understand. 20 small candles burned beneath her amber eyes, their orange light catching the faint blue markings along her temples. Around her, a dozen off-duty technicians laughed. Not cruelly. Daniel knew that immediately. Someone had simply told the Valari engineer to make a wish before helping blow out the candles. And Sailora had responded with the same serious curiosity she brought to atmospheric pressure reports. It is tradition, one technician explained. Sailora tilted her head. The combustion has a cultural function. More laughter followed. Her vertical pupils narrowed. Daniel saw the change because he had spent 3 years working galley maintenance on Port Meridian, and 3 years around exhausted travelers had taught him that embarrassment often looked quieter than anger. Sailora gave a polite nod, stepped away from the table, and disappeared through the sliding doors. The celebration resumed almost immediately. Daniel did not. Outside the observation windows, an electromagnetic storm rolled across the gas giant below, turning the clouds violet and silver. The station vibrated softly as stabilization thrusters compensated for another pressure wave. Somewhere behind Daniel, an oven chimed. He opened it, checked a tray of dinner rolls, and tried to forget the expression on Sailora's face. He failed. 20 minutes later, the galley had emptied. Daniel was shutting down the food printers when a scheduling notice appeared on his maintenance tablet. He almost dismissed it. Then one line caught his attention. Sailor Aven, Atmospheric Systems Inspector. Biological age equivalent, 28 Earth years. Registration date, October 17th. Daniel glanced at the station clock. October 17th. He frowned and reopened the personnel calendar. Human employees had birthdays marked with small gold symbols. Valari records showed only registration dates, plain and administrative. Sailora's was today. Huh, Daniel whispered. He found her an hour later in Observation Bay 3. She stood alone before a window nearly 30 feet high, watching lightning move silently through the atmosphere below. Her blue skin looked almost silver in the reflected storm light. You disappeared, Daniel said. Sailora glanced toward him. The gathering did not require me. You looked uncomfortable. I misunderstood a human ritual. That is not unusual. Daniel leaned against the railing, leaving several feet between them. The candles. Yes. She looked back toward the planet. Your people place controlled flames on food, extinguish them with breath, and privately request something from the universe. Daniel smiled. It sounds stranger when you say it like that. It is strange. Fair. The station hummed around them. Daniel looked down at his tablet, then at her. Can I ask you something? You already have. That is technically true. For the first time, the corner of her mouth moved slightly. Daniel held up the tablet. Your registration date is today. Correct. That is your birthday. Sailora's expression remained blank. My birth date. Right. Did nobody celebrate yours? She turned fully toward him. Celebrate what? Daniel thought she was joking. Then he saw her eyes. She genuinely did not know. The day you were born. Why would that require celebration? Daniel had no quick answer. Sailora continued calmly. Valari birth records establish age, civic eligibility, employment status, and service obligations. Nothing more. So no cake. No. Candles. No. Presents. She shook her head. Daniel stared at the date again. 28 years. 28 trips around her world's sun, and apparently nobody had ever stopped to tell her that reaching another one mattered. He slipped the tablet back onto his belt. Okay. Sailora studied him suspiciously. Okay, what? Nothing. That was another lie, and Daniel knew she probably heard it. He returned to the galley after midnight, opened the emergency pantry, and stared at what remained after 3 delayed supply ships. Flour, powdered eggs, synthetic vanilla. Then, behind 2 nutrient containers, he found a sealed jar of Valari bluefruit preserve. Daniel held it beneath the cold storage light and remembered a small bakery in Michigan, his mother's hands covered in flour, and something she used to say whenever a cake came out crooked. It does not have to be perfect. It just has to tell someone you remembered. Daniel looked toward the dark galley door. Then he reached for a mixing bowl. Daniel had not baked a cake in nearly 12 years, and at 12:37 in the morning, surrounded by humming food printers and emergency ration containers, he discovered that memory was less reliable than he had hoped. He measured the flour twice. The powdered eggs looked suspicious but smelled normal after rehydration. Synthetic vanilla came from a bottle designed for commercial kitchens and nearly overwhelmed the entire bowl when his hand slipped. Daniel stared at the mixture. Mom would disown me. The galley ventilation system answered with a mechanical hum. Outside the narrow service window, violet flashes from the electromagnetic storm illuminated Port Meridian every few seconds. 3 supply ships remained delayed beyond the storm perimeter, which explained why Daniel had exactly 1 cup of real flour left after the first attempt collapsed in the center. He considered quitting. Then he remembered Sailora standing in Observation Bay 3. Celebrate what? Daniel cleaned the bowl and started again. He had grown up above a small bakery outside Grand Rapids, Michigan, where mornings began before sunrise and everything smelled like yeast, coffee, and warm sugar. His mother had never measured vanilla carefully. She had poured until it smelled right. Daniel tried that. Better. The second cake rose unevenly but held together. He set it on the cooling rack and opened the jar of Valari Blue Fruit Preserve. The label identified it as safe for human consumption and compatible with standard Valari dietary requirements. Daniel tasted a tiny amount anyway. Sweet at first, then sharp, almost like blueberry mixed with lime. That works. He spread a thin layer across the cake and used the remaining vanilla frosting around the edges. The result leaned slightly to one side. Daniel studied it for several seconds. You have character. At 1:17, the galley door opened. Daniel turned too quickly and nearly dropped the frosting knife. Sailora stood in the doorway wearing her dark blue station uniform, silver-white hair tied loosely behind her head. The faint markings along her temples glowed softly against her blue skin. Her vertical pupils moved from Daniel to the flour on the counter, then to the cake. You are still working. Technically. She stepped inside. The atmospheric monitoring system registered unusual particulate levels in this compartment. Daniel looked at the flour covering his shirt. That might be me. Sailora approached the counter. Her expression became more puzzled with every step. You manufactured another ceremonial food object. I baked a cake. For whom? Daniel hesitated. He had planned to wait until morning. He had imagined finding a candle, maybe cleaning the galley first, possibly making the cake look less like it had survived atmospheric entry. But Sailora was already here. You. She stopped. Me? Your birth date is not over for another 43 minutes. Sailora stared at the cake. Daniel, I explained that Valari do not observe this custom. I know. Then why did you do this? He set the knife down. Because you have never had one. Her eyes lifted toward him. That is not a reason. It was enough of one for me. Silence settled over the galley. The refrigeration unit clicked off, leaving only the distant vibration of the station and rain-like particles from the storm brushing against the outer hull. Sailora looked again at the uneven frosting. How much did this cost? Almost nothing. How long did it take? Daniel glanced at the failed first cake sitting discreetly inside a disposal container. That information is classified. Her mouth moved slightly. She had learned enough human humor to recognize the evasion. You spent your rest period making something I did not request. Yes. And you expect nothing in exchange? Daniel shook his head. Sailora seemed more unsettled by that answer than anything else. She moved closer to the counter, but did not touch the cake. On Velar, recognition is earned through contribution, academic advancement, public service, scientific achievement. A person is acknowledged for what they provide. Daniel leaned against the counter. Sounds exhausting. It is efficient. Those are not always the same thing. She looked at him. Daniel did not argue further. He simply opened a drawer and searched until he found a single emergency celebration candle left from the earlier party. He placed it carefully in the center of the crooked cake. Sailora watched him light it. A tiny orange flame appeared between them. Reflected in her amber eyes, it looked impossibly warm against the cold blue light of Port Meridian. What happens now? She whispered. Daniel smiled. Now you get to decide. Sailora did not decide. For nearly 10 seconds, she simply watched the candle burn. The flame leaned whenever Port Meridian's ventilation system shifted, then straightened again, a tiny orange point surrounded by stainless steel counters and cold blue station light. Daniel waited. He had learned years ago that silence did not always need fixing. What are my choices? She finally asked. You can blow it out and request something from the universe. That part is optional. Does the request remain private? Usually. Sailora considered this with surprising seriousness. And if I choose not to extinguish it? Daniel shrugged. Then we let it burn for a while. Her amber eyes moved back to the flame. I prefer that. Daniel nodded. Then that is what we do. He pulled 2 plates from a cabinet and cut the cake. The knife passed through the blue fruit layer, leaving a streak of deep violet against the pale interior. He placed the first slice in front of her. Sailora looked at it, but did not reach for the fork. You still have not explained what I accomplished. Nothing. Her vertical pupils narrowed. That seems contradictory. You did not accomplish anything by having a birthday. Daniel cut himself a smaller slice. That is kind of the point. Then what exactly are you recognizing? He took a breath, searching for words that would not turn a simple cake into a lecture. That you are here. Sailora waited for more. Daniel gave her none. That is all. That is enough. The markings along her temples brightened slightly. Daniel had noticed they often did that when she was concentrating. On Velar, recognition without achievement would be considered indulgent. Maybe. Children receive acknowledgement when they complete developmental milestones. Adults receive it for service, research, leadership, or contribution to family units. Sounds organized. It is. Do you like it? The question stopped her. Sailora looked down at the cake. Whether I like it is irrelevant. Daniel lifted his fork, but did not eat. That was not what I asked. Outside the galley window, violet light rippled across the station hull as another wave from the electromagnetic storm passed Port Meridian. The overhead fixtures dimmed for half a second, then returned. Sailora remained silent. At last she picked up her fork and tasted the cake. Daniel watched her face carefully. Well, she chewed with the solemn concentration of someone evaluating laboratory evidence. The texture is inconsistent. Daniel sighed. Brutal. The blue fruit is too acidic for the frosting. I knew I should have used less. She took another bite. However, the combination is pleasant. I will take that as a victory. Another small movement touched the corner of her mouth. Daniel ate his own slice. It was definitely uneven. His mother would have criticized the crumb, adjusted the frosting, then served it anyway. The memory arrived with the vanilla, warm and sudden. For a moment, he could almost hear the old bakery refrigerator humming behind him instead of Port Meridian's life support system. Your mother taught you this? Sailora asked. Daniel looked up. How did you know? Your expression changed when you tasted it. He smiled faintly. Yeah, she owned a bakery in Michigan. I helped when I was a kid. Did she prepare cakes for your birth date? Every year. Even when you had accomplished nothing? Daniel laughed softly. Especially then. Sailora looked toward the candle again. It had burned lower, a small trail of wax gathering near the base. Daniel. Yeah. If birthdays are not about achievement, why do humans celebrate them? He set down his fork. There were probably 100 answers. Tradition. Family. Gratitude. Fear of time passing. Hope for more of it. Daniel chose the simplest one. Sometimes people just want you to know they are glad you were born. Sailora became completely still. The station hummed. The storm flashed beyond the window. Orange candlelight moved across her blue face and reflected inside her amber eyes. She looked away before Daniel could decide what the expression meant. That is an unusual thing to celebrate, she said quietly. Maybe. Daniel took another bite of imperfect cake. Does not make it a bad one. The candle continued burning between them. Sailora never blew it out. She stayed until the flame became too small to hold itself upright, then watched Daniel extinguish it safely with a metal cap. When he reached to throw the candle away, her hand moved first. May I keep that? Daniel looked at the short piece of wax in her palm. Sure. Why are you smiling? No reason. Sailora slipped the candle carefully into the pocket of her uniform. Outside, the storm brightened until the entire galley window turned violet. This time, the station lights did not immediately recover. The darkness lasted 3 seconds. Long enough for the galley ventilation to fall silent. Long enough for Daniel to hear the low mechanical vibration beneath Port Meridian disappear. Then the emergency system engaged. Thin red lights illuminated the floor, and a calm station voice filled the room. Primary power interruption. Auxiliary systems active. All personnel remain in designated compartments. Daniel was already moving. He grabbed his maintenance tablet and opened the thermal network. Half the display was amber. 3 sections were red. That is not good. Sailora stood beside the table, the extinguished candle still tucked safely inside her uniform pocket. Atmospheric control? Still running. Heating circulation is not. Daniel enlarged the schematic. Port Meridian orbited far enough above the gas giant that external temperatures could fall below -100 degrees Fahrenheit during the station's night cycle. The hull insulation bought time. It did not buy forever. Residential Ring 2 just lost thermal circulation. Sailora stepped closer. How long before temperatures become unsafe? If auxiliary heaters start, hours. If they do not, less. Daniel tapped the restart command. Nothing happened. He tried again. System isolation active. Of course. He grabbed his work jacket from the chair. Sailora watched him. Where are you going? Maintenance deck 6. Manual restart. Station protocol requires personnel to report to emergency shelter zones. Station protocol also assumes the pumps restart when asked nicely. Daniel clipped his tablet to his belt and headed for the door. Stay here until the evacuation lights direct you. Daniel. He turned. Sailora glanced toward the unfinished cake. The single candle was gone from its center, leaving a tiny circle in the frosting. Thank you. Daniel smiled. You are welcome. The corridor outside had transformed. Normal white lighting was gone. Red strips ran along the floor toward shelter areas while emergency bulkheads stood open at major intersections. Crew members moved calmly through the station, guided by automated instructions in 6 languages. Beyond the observation windows, the electromagnetic storm had swallowed the gas giant in violet light. Daniel reached the service elevator and found it disabled. Perfect. He took the stairs. 6 decks below, the air already felt colder. His breath became faintly visible near the maintenance hatch. The thermal control room smelled of metal, insulation, and overheated circuitry. Daniel opened the main circulation cabinet. Pump 1 showed no response. Pump 2 had entered protective shutdown. Pump 3 was waiting for manual synchronization. All right, he whispered. One problem at a time. He removed the outer panel and connected his diagnostic scanner. The numbers were ugly but manageable. He rerouted auxiliary current to pump 3 and began resetting the pressure sequence by hand. Above him, something heavy moved inside the ventilation system as emergency dampers changed position. The station voice returned. Electromagnetic intensity increasing. Non-essential personnel proceed to protected shelter areas. Daniel checked the temperature feed. Residential Ring 2 had dropped 4 degrees Fahrenheit. He kept working. A warning appeared on his tablet. Thermal control room sealing in 60 seconds. Daniel stared at it. The automated system had classified the maintenance deck as an exposed engineering zone. You have got to be kidding me. He gathered his tools and reached the door just as the bulkhead began descending. He hit the override. Access denied during storm protocol. Maintenance authorization. Daniel Mercer, 7 Port Meridian. Access denied. The door sealed with a deep mechanical click. Daniel stood alone beneath red emergency lights. He checked the communication panel. Static. His personal transmitter could reach internal engineering channels, but the storm had reduced the signal to fragments. He tried anyway. Maintenance control. This is Mercer on deck 6. I am sealed inside thermal control. Manual circulation restart is incomplete. Only static answered. Daniel looked at the pump indicators. Residential temperatures continued falling. He could wait for rescue or finish the restart. He turned back toward the open cabinet. Happy birthday to me, he muttered, then paused at his own joke. Somewhere several decks above, Sailora stood at an evacuation checkpoint when her wrist terminal displayed the same alert. Maintenance technician Daniel Mercer. Location, thermal control room. Status, isolated. She read it once. Then again. Around her, personnel continued towards safety. Sailora reached into her pocket and closed her fingers around a small piece of candle wax. Somebody is glad you were born. The words returned with uncomfortable clarity. She looked toward the shelter doors, then toward the maintenance access corridor. For 28 years, Sailora had been taught that usefulness determined value. That night, for the first time, she turned away from the rule. Sailora reached the maintenance corridor 30 seconds before the final emergency bulkhead sealed behind her. The red floor lights painted narrow reflections across her blue skin as she studied the station map on her wrist terminal. Daniel was 2 decks below, but the direct stairwell had already locked under storm protocol. She opened the atmospheric engineering network instead. Port Meridian had been designed around redundancy. Every inhabited compartment needed more than one route for air, pressure, and heat. People used corridors. Machines used something else. Ventilation bypass, she whispered. A service schematic appeared. Sailora followed it through a narrow access passage behind the atmospheric filtration room. The temperature fell with every 100 feet. By the time she reached Deck 6, her breath showed clearly in front of her. Inside thermal control, Daniel had stopped thinking about the cold. Pump 3 occupied all of his attention. He adjusted the manual pressure regulator by fractions while watching circulation numbers climb, stall, then fall again. Residential Ring 2 was now 57 degrees Fahrenheit and dropping. "Come on," he murmured. His radio crackled. "Daniel." He froze. "Sailora." Static swallowed half her reply. "Where are you?" "Outside your compartment." Daniel looked toward the sealed bulkhead. "You were supposed to evacuate." "I am aware." "Then why are you on Deck 6? A pause. "Your circulation sequence is wrong." Daniel stared at the radio. "That is your answer?" "No. It is the immediate problem." Despite himself, Daniel smiled. "All right. Tell me what you see." Sailora had reached an atmospheric service terminal outside the control room. She pulled up the same thermal network from the environmental side. Pump 3 is receiving sufficient power, but the return pressure is unstable because the ventilation dampers closed during isolation. Daniel checked his panel. She was right. "Can you reopen them?" "Not from this terminal. I can reroute airflow through the secondary environmental loop. That system is rated for atmosphere, not thermal circulation. Air does not care what department owns the pipe." Daniel laughed once. "That might be the most human thing you have said all night." Sailora did not understand why that pleased her. She entered the bypass sequence. Somewhere inside the walls, dampers shifted with deep metallic clicks. Daniel watched the pressure gauge rise. 40%, 55, 72. "Hold it there." "Holding." Daniel synchronized Pump 3. The machine shuddered, then settled into a steady mechanical hum. Warm circulation began moving through Residential Ring 2. On Daniel's tablet, the temperature stopped falling at 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Then it climbed by 1 degree. He exhaled. "We have heat." The station voice confirmed thermal restoration seconds later. Emergency locks released in stages. Daniel's bulkhead rose slowly, revealing Sailora standing on the other side beneath red light. Her silver-white hair had loosened around her face, and the glowing markings along her temples were brighter than he had ever seen them. Daniel stepped through. "You ignored an evacuation order." "Yes." "You crawled through a ventilation service route." "It was not designed for crawling." "I remained upright for most of it." Daniel stared at her. "That is your defense." "I am an atmospheric engineer." "Inspector." Sailora hesitated. "Both." Daniel noticed the hesitation, but let it pass. "Why did you come back?" She reached into her uniform pocket. When her hand emerged, the short birthday candle rested in her palm. Its wick was black from the flame that had burned in the galley less than an hour earlier. "You said birthdays mean someone is glad a person was born." Daniel's expression softened. Sailora looked at the candle rather than at him. "I have been considering the logic." "Dangerous habit." "Very." She finally raised her amber eyes. "If your existence was worth recognizing when nothing had been accomplished, then it could not become less valuable merely because the station became inconvenient." Daniel had no joke ready for that. Around them, pumps hummed steadily and warm air began returning through the vents. Sailora closed her fingers around the candle. "I still do not completely understand your tradition." Daniel smiled. "You came back for me." He glanced toward the rising temperature display. "I think you understand enough." The storm did not end quickly. For the next 4 hours, Port Meridian remained under auxiliary power while electromagnetic waves rolled across the gas giant below like silent violet tides. Daniel and Sailora stayed on Deck 6, monitoring the thermal system they had managed to stabilize. By 5:30 in the morning, Residential Ring 2 had climbed back to 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Daniel sat on an equipment case with a cup of terrible vending machine coffee warming his hands. Sailora stood beside the main console, reviewing pressure curves as if she had not spent part of the night navigating maintenance passages to reach him. "You know," Daniel said, "most people celebrate birthdays with less plumbing." Sailora looked over. "Perhaps human traditions require clearer documentation." "Absolutely not." Confusion is part of the experience. The faint markings along her temples brightened with what Daniel had begun to recognize as amusement. Then her wrist terminal chimed. A message appeared in a language Daniel could not read. Saylora's expression changed immediately. Her shoulders straightened. The warmth disappeared from her face. Problem, he asked. A communication from the Valari Cultural Directorate. Daniel lifted an eyebrow. Sounds important. It is. She closed the message. My preliminary assessment is overdue. Daniel took another sip of coffee. Assessment of what? Sailora hesitated long enough for him to notice. Human social behavior aboard Port Meridian. Daniel lowered the cup. I thought you were an atmospheric systems inspector. I am. And I serve as a cultural observer for the Valari Directorate. Daniel stared at her. You have 2 jobs? 3, technically. Now you are just showing off. She almost smiled, but the expression faded. My family has served the Directorate for generations. I was assigned here because human customs are becoming increasingly relevant to Valari diplomatic policy. Daniel leaned back against the bulkhead. Suddenly, small details made more sense. The precise questions, the careful observations, the way Sailora sometimes studied ordinary conversations as though they were engineering problems. So the birthday party was research. Initially. And the cake. Sailora looked down at her uniform pocket. The candle was still there. That became something else. The words hung quietly between them. Daniel did not ask what. Sailora turned toward the observation port built into the maintenance room. The storm had weakened enough for pale sunlight from Port Meridian's distant star to reach the station. Valari society values measurable contribution, she said. Our children are evaluated by development. Adults by service. Families by collective achievement. We consider this efficient because recognition follows evidence. Daniel nodded. You told me. I believed it completely. She paused. Until last night. Daniel said nothing. Sailora continued. You prepared something for me before I had done anything for you. Then when you were isolated, I realized I was measuring your value differently. Because I fixed the heating system? No. Her answer came immediately. She looked at him. Before you fixed it. Daniel became still. Sailora seemed almost surprised by her own conclusion. That is the problem. Why is that a problem? Because it contradicts what I was taught. Daniel set the coffee aside. Maybe it does not have to be a problem. What would you call it? He thought for a moment. New information. Sailora's amber eyes narrowed slightly. You are describing an emotional contradiction as if it were a technical update. I am talking to an engineer. That earned him the smallest smile. Her terminal chimed again. Report required. Sailora opened a blank document. Daniel stood and returned to the thermal console, giving her privacy. He expected her to begin with storm performance, station procedures, or human emergency behavior. Instead, she typed a title and stared at it for a long time. Daniel caught only a glimpse before turning away. The human practice of celebrating existence. Sailora reached into her pocket and placed the short candle beside the terminal. Its blackened wick leaned slightly to one side. A useless little object by every practical Valari standard. She touched it gently with one blue finger. Then she began to write. Sailora finished the report at 7:12 in the morning, just as Port Meridian restored full power. White ceiling lights replaced the emergency red. Ventilation returned to its familiar low hum, and somewhere beyond the maintenance deck, hundreds of people began returning to ordinary routines. She read the final paragraph twice before sending it. Daniel was replacing the thermal cabinet panel when her terminal gave a soft confirmation tone. Done, he asked. Sent. How badly did humanity score? Sailora considered him. Your species remains inefficient, emotionally inconsistent, unnecessarily attached to ceremonial food, and dangerously comfortable improvising around written procedures. Daniel tightened the final fastener. So, excellent marks. That was not my conclusion. It sounded promising. She slipped the terminal into her pocket, but the candle remained in her hand. Daniel noticed she had carried it for hours. Neither mentioned it. They returned to the main concourse together. Port Meridian looked almost normal again. Workers inspected ceiling panels. Cleaning machines removed condensation from the floors. The galley reopened with limited breakfast service, although Daniel discovered that someone had wisely disposed of his failed first cake. The second cake remained beneath a storage cover. One slice was missing from Sailora's side. 2 from Daniel's. Evidence preservation, he explained. Sailora gave him a look. You ate another piece. Evidence requires sampling. Before she could answer, her wrist terminal chimed again. This time the symbol on the display was gold. Sailora stopped walking. Daniel noticed several Valari personnel nearby straighten when they saw it. That one looks more serious. Sailora opened the message. Her vertical pupils tightened. The directorate reviewed my report. Already, my family designation accelerates certain communications. Daniel folded his arms. Family designation? She remained quiet for a moment. My mother serves on the Valari Intercultural Council. Daniel blinked. You left that part out. It was irrelevant to my work here. You are an atmospheric inspector, cultural observer, and the daughter of somebody important. That is an oversimplification. I am running out of job titles. A quiet laugh escaped her before she could stop it. Then she read the message again. They want clarification. About the storm? About the birthday. Daniel's amusement faded into curiosity. Sailora opened the attached response. The directorate had not rejected her observations. Instead, 11 senior reviewers had asked the same question in different forms. Why would humans recognize existence independently of measurable contribution? Sailora looked toward the galley, where the little cake sat beneath its clear cover. They think I misunderstood the ritual. Did you? She considered that. At first. And now. Sailora walked to a nearby table and placed her terminal down. A blank response field appeared. Daniel stayed standing, letting her choose whether the conversation continued. My report described the candle, the cake, and what you told me, she said. But they are treating it as a transaction whose benefit they cannot identify. Sounds familiar. She ignored that. They want the social function. Daniel pulled out a chair. What are you going to tell them? Sailora looked at the short candle in her palm. The truth. She began typing. Daniel could not read Valari script, but he watched her expression change as the sentences formed. Careful at first, then certain. When she finished, she turned the terminal so the translation faced him. Human birthday customs are not primarily rewards for productivity. Their function is recognition. The individual is acknowledged before achievement is considered. This distinction appears inefficient only if personal worth and usefulness are assumed to be identical. Daniel read the paragraph once. That is better than anything I would have written. I am not finished. Sailora added one final sentence. Then she stopped. Her finger hovered above the transmission control. Daniel read the words. When did usefulness become the price of being valued? He looked at her. That might annoy somebody. Yes. You still sending it? Sailora glanced at the candle, then toward the observation windows where the storm was finally breaking apart over the gas giant. Yes. She pressed send. For 28 years, Sailora had measured life by what it produced. One imperfect cake had introduced a variable her equations had never included. Somewhere across the stars, her people were about to receive it. For 3 days, nothing happened. Port Meridian returned to routine with the stubborn efficiency of a place built too far from home to remain disrupted for long. Supply ships finally crossed the storm perimeter. Residential temperatures stabilized at 71 degrees Fahrenheit. Daniel repaired 2 circulation valves, recalibrated a food printer, and discovered that somebody had eaten the last piece of Sailora's cake without admitting it. Sailora returned to atmospheric inspections, but something about her routine had changed. She still measured pressure twice. She still corrected technicians who rounded numbers unnecessarily. Yet Daniel began noticing small things. She thanked the galley attendant by name. She asked a tired cargo worker whether he had slept. Once, she left a cup of hot tea beside Daniel's tool case without explanation. On the 4th morning, Daniel found her standing alone in Observation Bay 3, exactly where they had spoken after the birthday party. The gas giant below was calm now, its enormous cloud bands turning gold beneath the distant star. Sailora held her wrist terminal against her chest. You look worried, Daniel said. I am uncertain. That is basically worry wearing an engineer's uniform. She gave him a patient look. The directorate responded. Daniel stopped beside the railing. And Sailora activated the terminal. My report was circulated beyond the review committee. Is that bad? I believed it would be. She looked through the window. My mother contacted me personally. Daniel waited. Sailora's temple markings brightened faintly. She asked me what flavor the cake was. Daniel blinked. That was not where I expected this to go. Neither was I. Sailora handed him the terminal. A translated message filled the screen. The Valari Intercultural Council had opened a formal discussion about recognition customs among younger citizens, medical patients, retirees, and individuals whose contributions could not easily be measured. There was no order to adopt human birthdays. No declaration that Valari tradition had been wrong. Only questions. Hundreds of them. Daniel scrolled slowly. One researcher asked whether children should receive acknowledgement independent of academic milestones. Another wondered whether elderly citizens still deserved ceremonial recognition after leaving public service. A medical specialist asked whether recovering patients should be praised for existing rather than progressing. Daniel looked up. You started all this with one report? Sailora shook her head. No. A question started it. Your question. Your cake. Daniel smiled. My cake was structurally questionable. Apparently, its philosophical integrity was sufficient. He laughed, and this time Sailora laughed with him. The sound was quiet, almost surprised, but no longer unfamiliar. Her terminal chimed again. Another message arrived, this one from her mother. Sailora read it silently. The glow along her temples strengthened. What does it say? Daniel asked. She turned the screen toward him. There were only 2 translated sentences. I reviewed your birth record this morning. I am glad you were born. Daniel felt something tighten gently in his chest. Sailora looked away toward the planet. She did not cry. She simply stood very still, holding the terminal with both hands as sunlight moved across her blue face. 28 years, she whispered. She has never said that. Daniel leaned against the railing beside her. How does it feel? Sailora considered the question with characteristic seriousness. I do not have an efficient word for it. Good. She looked at him. Good. Some things should be inefficient. Sailora lowered her eyes to the message again. After a moment, she reached into a small pocket inside her uniform and removed the candle. Daniel stared. You are still carrying that. It is evidence. Of what? Sailora rolled the little piece of wax between her blue fingers. That a ritual does not need to be logical to become important. Daniel nodded toward it. You going to keep it forever? No. Her answer came with a strange certainty. Until next year. Daniel raised an eyebrow. What happens next year? Sailora slipped the candle carefully back into her pocket. Then she walked toward the observation bay exit, leaving Daniel beside the railing. At the doorway she turned, amber eyes bright with an expression he could not quite identify. I have 12 months to learn how to bake. 1 year later, Daniel Mercer walked into the Port Meridian galley at 11:48 at night and immediately smelled something burning. He stopped beneath the doorway sensor. That cannot be good. The overhead lights were off. Only the pale blue illumination from the food storage units outlined the counters, and somewhere near the ovens a ventilation fan worked considerably harder than usual. Daniel set down his tool case. Sailora, a metallic tray clattered. Do not enter yet. Daniel looked around the room. He was already standing inside. I think we missed that step. Silence followed. Then Sailora emerged from behind the preparation counter wearing a flower-covered galley apron over her dark blue uniform. Her silver-white hair had been tied back, although one loose strand crossed the glowing markings near her temple. Daniel stared at her. Sailora stared back. You saw nothing. I am seeing quite a lot. Daniel, is the oven supposed to be smoking? She turned quickly. It is not smoking. The blue fruit glazed caramelized beyond the intended range. That sounds suspiciously like engineer language for burned. Sailora narrowed her vertical pupils. Sit down. Daniel obeyed, mostly because he wanted to see what happened next. Sailora disappeared behind the counter again. He heard a cabinet open, something scrape across metal, and a quiet Valari phrase his translator politely declined to interpret. Then the galley lights dimmed completely. A small orange flame appeared. Then another. Sailora carried a cake toward him with both hands. It leaned noticeably to the left. The frosting was uneven. One edge was darker than the others. Daniel had never seen anything look more carefully made. She placed it on the table. 2 candles burned on top. You actually did it, he said. After 7 attempts. 7. The first 6 were educational. Daniel smiled. My mother would have liked you. Sailora sat across from him. For a moment, neither spoke. Beyond the galley window, the gas giant turned slowly beneath Port Meridian, calm tonight, its cloud bands silver beneath distant starlight. Daniel pointed toward the candles. Why 2? Sailora looked at the first flame. This one marks the day I was born. Her amber eyes moved to the second. And this one marks the day someone was glad I was. Daniel's smile faded into something quieter. Sailor reached into her uniform pocket and placed a tiny object beside the plate. The old candle. Short, slightly bent, its wick still blackened from the night 1 year earlier. You kept it. I said I would keep it until next year. You usually mean exactly what you say. Usually? Almost exactly. She ignored him, but the markings along her temples brightened. Daniel looked at the new candles. So what happens now? Sailor folded her hands carefully on the table. I believe I am supposed to make a private request from the universe. Only if you want to. I know. That answer mattered more than Daniel expected. A year earlier, she had asked what her choices were. Tonight, she already knew. Sailor closed her eyes. She remained still for several seconds while the two flames moved gently in the ventilation current. Then she opened her eyes and blew them out. Thin trails of smoke curled upward. Daniel waited. Well, you told me the wish remains private. I regret teaching you the rules. Sailor cut the cake and handed him the first slice. Daniel took one bite. His eyebrows rose. This is actually good. Your surprise is insulting. The smell when I walked in established expectations. She took her own bite and considered it critically. The texture could improve. Do not ruin the moment. Sailor smiled. Not the uncertain, almost smile from a year ago. A real one. Warm. Familiar. Outside, Port Meridian continued humming through the dark, carrying thousands of lives between worlds. Somewhere far away, Valari families had begun experimenting with their own small rituals of recognition. Some used candles. Others planted luminous flowers or prepared favorite meals. None called the practice human anymore. It had become something of their own. Daniel looked across the table at Sailora as she carefully saved the two new candles instead of throwing them away. 1 year earlier, he had baked an imperfect cake because a woman he barely knew had never been told her existence was worth celebrating. He had expected nothing from it. No reward. No cultural change. No moment like this. He had simply wanted her to know somebody remembered. Between them, two thin trails of smoke disappeared into the warm galley air. The flames were gone, but their meaning remained. Sometimes kindness did not change the universe with a grand gesture. Sometimes it changed one person who carried it home.